get started. Welcome, everybody. Today is Tuesday, September 10th, and we are talking about encumbrances today. Encumbrances. I like talking about encumbrances. This is a very, very broad category. So, how you can use your property that you own and you're paying for, it can be controlled by private restrictions and public restrictions, private and public restrictions. And these restrictions are collectively called encumbrances. Encumbrances. So encumbrances, by definition, are any issues either tangible or intangible. Okay, let's stop right there. Tangible or intangible. What does tangible mean? Remind me, guys, when I say tangible, what am I talking about? We can touch it, right? It's physically there. You can put your hands on it, right? So encumbrances are any issues that either you can touch it or you can't touch it, that affects the ability to convey. And what does convey mean? What does convey mean? Transfer, okay. Transfer a marketable title. And what does marketable title mean? It's funny, this one sentence has got like a zillion vocabulary words in it. Marketable title. A free and clear title, right? Free of clouds. A free and clear title. Easily transferred, right? Free and clear. But what does title mean? Title means ownership. Yes, so let's call it free and clear ownership. All right. So that's what an encumbrance is. Encumbrances are either issues, and issues are problems. Encumbrances are any issues either touchable or not touchable that affects the ability to transfer free and clear ownership of real property or how the property can be used by the owner. Okay, so that's what an encumbrance is. Any issues that are tangible or intangible that affects the ability to convey, transfer a marketable title, free and clear ownership of real property, a house, or how the property can be used by the owner. All right, that's what encumbrance is. So you'll remember that convey means to transfer. And when we say transfer property, there's three main ways. Remember, you could sell it, it could be sold, it can be willed, it could be left in it as an inheritance, or it could be gifted. Those are the three main ways that property is transferred between individuals. So that's what an encumbrance says. All right. So an encumbrance is anything that prevents a property from being sold, willed, or gifted from the old owner to a new owner. So this would be something that would prevent it from being sold, willed, or gifted, or dictates how the owner can use his property or affects the property in a negative way. So again, this is something that would prevent the property ownership from being transferred. It dictates how the owner can actually use their property, or it simply affects the property in a negative way. So having an encumbrance on your property doesn't mean that you can't transfer ownership. It just means there might be some issues that have to be cleared up before you can transfer the property to the new owner. All right. So notice that we've got this little cloud in my graphic here. So if we have an encumbrance, if we do a title search and an encumbrance is discovered, what do we call that? When there's a problem, let's go back and do our chapter 4 vocabulary. What do we call that when there is an encumbrance? When we do the title search and these issues come up, what does it create? That's where we get the expression a cloud on the title, right? Or clouded title. And a clouded title cannot be conveyed. Well, kind of depends on what the cloud is, doesn't it? Yeah. So that's why I've got this little cloud graphic right here, because when we have these issues, it can create a cloud on the title. So you guys know that I like to put things in charts. Here's a chart. Several different things fall under the category of encumbrances, several different categories. We have things called encroachments. We have things called a nuisance. We also have deed conditions and deed restrictions. We also have easements and liens. There's different types of easements and liens. There's also private restrictions. Okay, and that kind of overlaps a little bit with these. And then we have government powers, and that's where we would talk about ADA, taxation, police power, eminent domain zoning. So you can see that the term encumbrance or encumbrances, it's a very, very wide category, isn't it? It covers a lot of things. So in our session today, we are specifically going to talk about encroachments and nuisance. I don't think we're going to talk about deed conditions because we've talked about those when we did title and deeds, but we'll definitely talk about easements and liens. And then I cover private restrictions and government powers and other documents that I have. Okay. So that's our plan for today, you guys. That's what we're going to be talking about. Now, here's a graphic that I like to use to kind of give you a visual idea about encumbrances. I like to say that encumbrance is kind of an umbrella term. Have you guys heard that expression, umbrella term? It kind of covers a lot of things. A lot of things can go up under that umbrella coverage. Okay. So again, remember, encroachments, liens, easement, police power, deed conditions, nuisances, CC&Rs, zoning, that all falls under that general category of encumbrances. Okay. Makes sense, you guys? All right. We're good? We're good? That's what an encumbrance is. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to learn specific types of encumbrances, okay? Specific types of encumbrances. All right, the first one is an encroachment. An encroachment. And I got to say, this is probably my favorite encumbrance. This word is funny to me. An encroachment is a physical item that is crossing over a property line of another without permission. The encroachment can be hanging over or tunneling under the property line. What do you think is a very common example of an encumbrance? What do you think is a very common example of an encumbrance? There's two very, very common examples, right? And I've got some encumbrances right now on the side of my house. We would say a fence and some tree branches, right? A fence and some tree branches. I've got some tree branches hanging over my property line right now, and my neighbor, thank goodness my neighbor is cool. We've been talking to our neighbor about it for probably over 2 years now, and neither one of us, have gotten it taken care of. So that definitely is an encumbrance, right? Now, is this one a big deal though? Is this type of encumbrance gonna affect the transfer of my property if my boyfriend and I decided to sell this house? Not really. No, not really. Right? No. But would it be a good idea if we were going to sell the house to go ahead and have those tree limbs trimmed before we put the house up for sale? Probably would be a good proactive thing for us to do, right? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, the only problem with these tree limbs is they're kind of embedded in they're hanging over the line that connects the power from the light pole out front to the house. And so we're like, I don't want to get out there and we don't want to cut it ourselves. So we got to find a good company that won't charge us an arm or leg to do it. Okay. Now, here's another way to help you remember this word, encroachment. I always like to think about a roach. Imagine if you had a roach in your house and the roach was walking across your kitchen floor. Get it? Encroach, roach. And a roach is walking across your kitchen floor without your permission. So that's how I think about encroachments. That's my little brain trick to remember that one. Encroach, roach. All right, a nuisance. A nuisance. A nuisance occurs when a person uses his property in such a manner that it unreasonably interferes with the reasonable use or enjoyment of others' property. Such unreasonable use is considered to be a trespass on the senses. A nuisance is a non-physical invasion. Okay, so in other words, you're living in your property, but your neighbor next door is doing something in such a way that it is a constant just barrage on your senses. And that would be by sound, smell, light, dust, sight, or dangerous activity. So the example I have is these barking dogs. So if your neighbor had a lot of dogs next door, they're going to be barking all the time. And I got to say, this is probably the most common nuisance that I've ever heard of, right? You hear a lot of stories about people and their barking dogs, just constantly barking. Barking. All right, that could be a big deal. Can you guys think of another example of a nuisance, which would be a trespass on someone's senses? Other than the barking doggies. Anthony says loud music. Real estate says a cat that scratches your dog. Maybe a smell. Yeah, I would definitely say a smell. Maria says a rooster. Yes. If you guys have never lived in a neighborhood with a rooster crowing every morning, and they literally do that every morning, it's yes. I've lived in a neighborhood like that before, Maria. Anthony says a meth lab. Yeah, Anthony, that would do it too. Real estate says a cat enters the fences and won't go away. Yeah, that would definitely be a nuisance. Oh, I had an example I was going to tell you guys. What about when you have a neighbor who has really bright floodlights on the side of their house and they keep their floodlights on all night and they're so bright it looks like the sun is up? Yeah, that would definitely be a nuisance. Okay, so that's what a nuisance is. Now, as far as the cat, I think the cat might be trespassing and not really a nuisance. Because remember, a nuisance is an assault on your senses. So the deal with the cat, I think the cat might be trespassing. Because trespassing is when you're physically crossing onto someone else's property. But it's still very annoying, isn't it? All right, we have some feral cats in my neighborhood. I don't know if they're feral or they're just outdoor cats. And my dog one time thought she was big and bad, and she walked up on one of these cats, and she learned a lesson the hard way that she was not as big and bad as she thought she was. Listen, when a cat doesn't back away from a dog, when the cat just stands there, like, what do you want? That's the sign right there. You don't want to mess with that cat. All right, let's talk about easements. Let's discuss an easement. An easement is a legal right to use another's land for a specific and limited purpose. Okay? In other words, it's when somebody's granted an easement, they have a legal right to use your property, but they don't have any ownership interest in it. Let me repeat that. So an easement is when someone has a legal right to make use of your property and they can use it in a very limited manner, but they don't have any ownership interest in it. Okay? That is what an easement is. And there's different types of easement. The most common type of easement is a right of way to enter called ingress and egress. We'll talk about them a little bit more in a second. Okay, so this is what an easement is. There are two types of easements that we're going to study. We're going to learn about an easement appurtenance and an easement in gross. Easement appurtenance and easement in gross. Let's talk about these two types of easement. So again, the person who's using the easement doesn't have an ownership right in your property. They simply have the right to use it, but in a very limited manner. All right, let's talk about the easement appurtenance. An easement appurtenance involves two properties with two different property owners. And one property owner, let's say property A owner, has the right to use property B in a very limited and specific way. Basically, this happens when you have a landlocked property that's right behind a property that has road access. Okay. So here, and this is very common. This happens quite frequently. So we've got, let's say we got property A and we got property B right here. Now notice that property B is owned by Mrs. Red. And she has road access, right? She can easily enter and exit her property. But let's say there's a property behind her, property A. And right now, there's nobody living on property A. Okay? But let's say that property A is sold to Mr. Blue. All right. And Mr. Blue wants to build a house back there. Well, by law, Mr. Blue has to be given access to the road, even if that means he has to cross over someone else's property. Okay. So that access that he's going to be given, that's what's going to be called the easement appurtenance. So by law, Mrs. Red has to allow Mr. Blue the ability to cross over her property. And that little strip of land that he's going to cross over, that's the easement appurtenance right there. Susan says, can property B owner, Mrs. Red, refuse to allow property A owner the ingress and egress access? Susan, no, she cannot. But, you know, there's always a but. The problem is, Susan, in the real world, it's, yeah, if Mrs. Red, property B owner, doesn't want to give access, Mr. Blue is going to have to get a lawyer to sue for access. And it's going to get expensive. Yeah. That's why sometimes, guys, when you get your real estate license and you're helping a buyer, let's say you're working with a buyer and the buyer's looking for a piece of land and you find a piece of land and it's really cheap, but it's been on the market for a long time, that usually indicates that it has no road access and the property owners surrounding the property aren't being cooperative. They don't want to give an easement. Okay. Yeah, so in the real world, it gets really sticky. And this is one of these concepts that we learn in real estate school that sounds pretty straightforward, right? You have to give somebody the right to enter and exit their property. But in the real world, a lot of people don't play nice. Joe says, can she offer to sell that portion of the property, Mrs. Red? Sure, she could offer to sell it to property B, Mr. Blue. But you know, maybe Mr. Blue doesn't want to have to buy it. And really legally he shouldn't have to buy it because she's supposed to give him access to the land. So, okay. So word of caution, you guys, when you're in the future, when you are helping someone buy land and they're looking at a piece of land that's landlocked, proceed with caution. Because there are some landowners who, if you're out there walking on their property, especially if you're in a rural area, I'm in Alabama, and if you're out there walking on somebody's property, they might get a little testy with you. They might be a little aggressive with you. So just proceed with caution, okay? And be very careful in the future if you're doing that. All right. So we got to know the specific names of these properties, okay? So the property A, the one that's landlocked, this is called the dominant tenement. Dominant tenement, okay? And we can remember this because its need, Mr. Blue's need to get to the land is got to dominate over the other property, okay? Property B, the one that has road access, is called the servient tenement. Servient tenement. Think of it this way. Property B is serving a purpose. Okay? It's serving a purpose. It's providing access to property A. So make sure you remember those terms, okay? The strip of land that's being crossed over, this is the easement appurtenance. Property A, the one that's landlocked, and landlocked simply means it has no road access. The one that's landlocked is called the dominant tenement. The one that has road access and is being crossed over is called the servient tenement. Now, here's something important that we need to know about an easement appurtenance. It is attached to the servient tenement, so it's considered to be attached to property B, and it's said to run with the land. It runs with the land. And guys, I'm not gonna lie, when I was studying for my real estate license back in 2013, I thought that was the funniest expression. I thought that expression was so odd. Runs with the land. Huh? Dirt? What does that mean? Basically, that means when Mrs. Red sells her land, the new owner has to uphold that easement. They have to allow for that easement, okay? It runs with the land. So when Mrs. Red sells her property, it doesn't go away. All right. So for example, let's say that Mrs. Red sells her property to, or Mr. Blue, it works both ways. I'm sorry. Mr. Blue, let's say he sells his house to the Greens. Does Mrs. Red still have to provide access to the Greens? Does she still have to uphold that easement? Yes. Definitely. Okay. And now if Mrs. Red sells her property to Mr. Purple, does Mr. Purple still have to honor the easement? You betcha. Because this easement runs with the land. It runs with the land. All right. Does that make sense to you guys? So easement appurtenance, an easement concerning two separate properties with separate owners. The landlocked property is called the dominant tenement. The property with road access that's being crossed over is called the servient tenement. It's serving a purpose. Very good, guys. All right, now, here's what's kind of difficult and sticky about easements. While recording is not necessary for validity, in other words, you don't have to record it for it to be valid. The recorded easement provides constructive notice, it's another vocabulary word, to third parties that the easement exists. So again, in textbooks, it says that easements don't have to be recorded to be valid. But what's the problem if the easement's never been recorded? What's the problem if it's always just been there and there's nothing really official in the public records about it? Can you guys think of any issues that are going to come up from that? Real estate says time and use. Susan says third parties won't know. Yeah, it's gonna be really hard to enforce it, right? It's not gonna be revealed in the title search because it's not there. It's just gonna make it harder in the future for people of property A and owners of property B to enforce it and say, hey, there is an easement here. There's a legitimate easement right here, right? It's not gonna come up in a title search. So, yeah. And that's kind of like a lot of things have changed since public records have been digitized, since now we have the internet and computers and everything is being digitized and put into the public records. So a lot of those recording issues that we had in the past, we don't really see anymore. So I kind of feel like easements is the last unknown because there's so many people that had easements back in the day when people knew their neighbors and it wasn't a big deal. But now, how many of you guys actually know who your neighbors are? Like really know who your neighbors are? We just don't have that anymore, do we? Like I know my neighbors, but I don't have them over to my house all the time, right? So I think this is one of those last challenges that we're seeing in real estate is easements. That's just my 2 cents though. All right. Another type of easement that we need to discuss, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this one, you guys. I just want you to know what it is as a vocabulary word. This is an easement in gross. An easement in gross. A type of easement that involves one property owner and its owner and another individual or entity. An easement in gross. It basically allows an individual to access another person's property for their benefit. The easement belongs to the person or company benefiting from the easement. And the most common easement in gross would be a utility easement. And we've all seen examples of utility easements, right? And I think the most common utility easement is the electric company power lines. Have you guys ever you see the power line stretching over the land? My mom has power lines, a big power line running right across her 80 acres. And the power company comes out there periodically and they cut the shrubs and the bushes out from underneath those power lines. And when they come out there, Alabama Power, they don't ever, or my mom has Pioneer Electric. They don't ever ask my mom, hey, is it okay if we come on your land and cut these bushes underneath these power lines? They just come out there. That's an easement in gross. That's an easement in gross. Same thing with utility easements. Have any of you guys ever had like the cable company or the water company come and work in front of your house, digging up the cable lines or the water line? Have you ever had that happen? Anthony, you've had it? Anthony, did they ask you for permission? Did they say, yo, Anthony, we're gonna come work on your line today. How about that? Is that okay with you? Can we come around 1 o'clock? Did they ever say that to you, Anthony? Or they just showed up? They may have given you a notice. If it's the water company, they maybe notified you that they were going to turn the water off, right? The water was, I've gotten those before in my old neighborhood. They were turning off the water at 8 a.m. Right? That's a very common utility easement. Okay, very good. Good job, guys. So, don't get too caught up in easements. There's only 5 questions. All right. On these, on your state licensing exam. So easement appurtenance, 2 pieces of property, 2 different owners, dominant tenement, servient tenement. And easement and gross, 1 property and the owner and another entity or another person. Or let's say it says, are HOA easements up to 17 feet or more on your property to access utilities? HOA easements, I don't know, it might not be an HOA easement. It usually, they usually call it a setback. If the HOA and this is more of the CC&Rs, the covenants, conditions, and restrictions, a setback. Yeah. And it varies. It varies by community. It varies. Because real estate brings up a good point. One of the things I want you guys to do is I want you to drive through, or if you have a chance, drive through some older neighborhoods that were built in the 60s, and then drive through some of these newer neighborhoods. And one thing you're going to notice is older neighborhoods have bigger lots, and there's a lot more space between the houses, and the houses generally set back further from the street. Now, one thing I've noticed with these newer neighborhoods, the houses are a lot closer together. The lots are very narrow, and the houses sit a lot closer to the street. So when you get a chance, drive through and compare older neighborhoods versus newer neighborhoods. And that's why the easements will change. The utility easements change over time based on when the house was built and what that planning department approved at that particular moment. So it varies. It varies by state, it varies by county, it varies by neighborhood. It all just depends on what they got approved. So there isn't like a standard that everyone has to follow. All right. Now, let's talk about how we can describe these easements, okay? These are just ways to describe them. So we have one called an affirmative easement. An affirmative easement. The right to use the land of another for some stated purpose. So you're giving someone permission to do something. Affirmative. Yes, you can do it. All right. For example, if a person has a right to cross over your property, this is an example of an affirmative easement. So this is simply a way to describe an easement. Think of it like a positive thing. You're letting someone do something. So a utility easement would be an example of an affirmative easement. Okay, you're giving someone the right to do it, okay? The opposite of an affirmative easement would be a negative easement. A negative easement, the right to prohibit an owner from a certain use. In other words, a way to describe an easement that prevents something from happening. Okay, this is a negative easement. For example, if a person has an easement that restricts his neighbor from building a 3-story house because doing so would block the view, this would be described as a negative easement. Negative easement. Okay. That's a negative easement. So you're preventing somebody from doing something. Negative easement. So it can be a positive, got permission, negative, can't do it. And I think I read something somewhere, guys, that in Washington, D.C., that there couldn't be any buildings taller than the Washington Monument. Have you guys ever heard that? Or is that just an urban myth that I read somewhere? I feel like I read that somewhere at one point. You couldn't have any buildings taller than Washington Monument. Because if you guys have ever visited our nation's capital, the buildings in DC are very short compared to other major cities. Maybe that was just an urban myth I read. All right. Another way to describe an easement is an implied easement. And I'll be honest with you guys, I'm really not sure about how an implied easement would be enforced, but this is a vocabulary word we need to know. Although not expressly stated, this is a type of easement that's created by the intent of the parties. A grantor, remember that's the old owner, conveys the implied right to use those apparent invisible easements that are necessary for reasonable use of the property conveyed. So for example, let's say we have a large piece of land that's next to a lake, and it only can be divided into two lots with only one having access to the water. An implied easement may exist to allow the owners of the inner lot to get to the lake, or the other lot to get to the lake. Okay, so at one time this was one large property, but it was divided in such a way that one property only had lake access. So there's an implied easement to allow the other one to get to the lake. Oh, hold on, we got a post about the Washington Monument. Okay, Anthony, thank you. Yes, in Washington, D.C., there are height restrictions on how tall buildings can be constructed. These limits are governed primarily by the Height of Buildings Act of 1910, which restricts the height of buildings to ensure they do not overshadow important landmarks like the U.S. Capitol and the Washington Monument. I thought I had read that somewhere. Thank you, Anthony, for fact checking for me. All right, now I know. Good deal. Yeah, if you guys have ever been to Washington, D.C., that's one of the first things I noticed was, wow, normally if it's a big city, they've got really tall skyscrapers. Most big cities do, right? Like New York, LA, Chicago, Atlanta. But not in Washington, D.C. Thank you, Anthony. All right. So now that we know different types of easements, we know different ways to describe these easements. Now we need to talk about how we can create these easements, okay? So we're shifting gears a little bit. We're still talking about easements, but this time we're going to talk about how we can create these easements, okay? There's different ways to create easements, but we specifically are going to go over these. Easements by written agreements, easements by necessity, easements by condemnation. And then the strangest of all easements, easement by prescription or adverse possession. So let's tackle these before we run out of time. All right, this one sounds like the most logical one, right? Easement by written agreement. Created between the owner of the land which the easement runs across and the easement holder, as in between a property owner and a utility companies. So let's say that the local electrical company comes to you and says, hey, we've got to put in a new line, a new set of power lines, and we need to be able to cross over your property. And so you guys come to an agreement with use a written agreement to establish that easement. Or another example would be maybe a cell phone tower. Maybe you got lucky and Verizon contacted you and said, hey, we want to put a Verizon cell phone tower on your land. We're going to pay you. And you're like, yay. And they don't want to buy the land, but they want to have an easement to use it. Right? That would be awesome, wouldn't it? Sajinder says, my son's school trip is going to DC next month. Well, Sajinder, have a good time. Have a good time in DC. It's a very interesting city. And it's confusing on purpose. It was designed to be confusing. It's the genders. Our founding fathers designed it to be confusing so the British would get confused when they came over, and it just confuses all of us now the way it's put together. All right. The next one is easement by necessity. Necessity. Oh, guys, what is a necessity? When I say a necessity, what is a necessity? What are the necessities? Something you need, right? It's something you got to have it. You need, Joe says you need it. It's a necessity. It's something you can't go without. Okay. For me, it's coffee in the morning. And I have to have liquid half and half. I can't, I have to have liquid half and half now. I cannot do the powder stuff anymore. It's a necessity. All right. So easement by necessity. Joe says sleep for her. Joe, me too. I'll be honest with you. My boyfriend says I get really cranky when I'm tired, and he's correct. I'm a little bit of a brat when I get tired. Joe, you and I, we're on the same page there. All right. Easement by necessity. We need the easement. It's needed. Since creating useless landlocked property is against public policy, most states recognize that a property owner has a right to be able to enter ingress, and exit egress their property. Most states recognize that right. This type of easement is created out of necessity because it is vital, super important, vital to gaining access to the property. All right, that's an easement by necessity. We have to have it. You have to have road access to your property. The other one is easement by condemnation, and this one is created through eminent domain. Eminent domain. Do any of you guys know what eminent domain is? That's a good vocabulary word there. Can y'all put that in the chat for me? What is eminent domain? What is eminent domain? Olga says, good morning, Miss Olga. Miss Olga says, when the government takes your land for public use. Yes. Joe says police power to take the land for the good of public use. That's correct. Rebecca says right of government to take property for public use. Yeah. Very good. Very good. So that is easement by condemnation, because remember, eminent domain is the government's right to take your private property for public use. The act of taking it is condemnation, easement by condemnation. So again, the government comes in, says, hey, we need this land. This is the only land that will do. We're going to pay you fair market value for it, but you can't say no. We're taking it. That is easement by condemnation. All right. And then the last one is easement by prescription. Brianna says it's sad. Brianna, I agree. I agree. It is sad. And it's one of those topics, honestly, that makes me sad to talk about it. I always get a little sad when I discuss eminent domain. I'll be honest with you. Yeah, especially when I drive through cities and I see like blatant examples of eminent domain, then I really get upset. I'm with you, Brianna. I'm totally with you. All right. Last but not least is easement by prescription or adverse possession. Okay, let's just break down the definition here before we get to what it is. When you possess something, right, that means you own it, correct? Right? When you have possession, we can all agree that that means you own it, right? Okay. Ownership, possession. But what is adverse? When something is adverse, adverse possession. When something has adverse side effects. Anytime you hear the word adverse, adverse is bad. It's negative, right? Negative. So this is kind of like negative ownership. Ah. But who's it negative for? It's negative for the first owner. Oh, Maria says contrary. Oh, I like that. Maria, contrary. Yes. Okay, so that's what adverse possession is a legal doctrine that allows a person to claim a property right in land owned by another. So it's going to give you the right to take somebody's property even when you don't own it. It's not yours. That sounds kind of crazy, doesn't it? All right. So tell you what, since we're so close to the end of the hour, I am going to go ahead and break now because I know you guys are going to have a lot of questions about adverse possession because it's so wonky. All righty. So let's go ahead and break now. And then when we get back, we'll start right here with adverse possession. So we'll have plenty of time to answer your questions. Here's the handout in case you haven't grabbed it already. All righty. You guys got the handout? And then I will see you guys back in an hour and we'll continue our discussion on encumbrances in general and specifically adverse possession. All right. Thanks, you guys. Have a good break. I'll see you in an hour. I gotta go make some breakfast. Bye, guys. Thank you.